Hi everyone, my name is Jennifer Cunningham. I'm the AVP for Alumni Relations at Lehigh University, and I am here today with Jim Robinson. He is class of '82 and a graduate of class of '84. He's the advisory chair for the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness, and he'll tell us exactly what that organization does in a minute. And he's also the principal of James Robinson Consulting. A topic that we are all anxious, very anxious to hear about, and we're grateful for Jim for taking time out of his, I'm sure, extremely busy schedule to talk to us about this important topic. Just a couple housekeeping things. You'll see here that we have about 119 participants, so we will be taking questions via the chat box and not the phone. So to ask a question or make a comment during the webinar, just click on that chat box and then type your questions or comments in, and I will read them aloud to Jim. We may not get to all of them, but we will provide him with those questions and comments after the webinar, and he'll get back to you with the answers if he knows them. We will conclude right at 12:30 to be respectful of everybody's time. So if you do have questions, get them in early, and I will also try to consolidate if a lot of you have the same kinds of questions. You can either put a question or comment into all participants or just to the panelists, which are me and Jim. That's your choice. All right, let's get started. Jim.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you all for your time today and for the invitation to share what Sepi is doing. I'll be going very quickly, but be providing some references for you to follow up on after the call. Sepi is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation. For more information, you can find us on www.sepi.net. On the agenda today, I'll tell you who Sepi is, how we are preparing for global pandemics, how we're responding specifically to COVID, and what we're doing to supply vaccine to the world as quickly as we can. So Sepi is a global coalition. It's formed from lessons learned from the Ebola outbreak of 2014 and 2015. It is, our focus is to look at priority threats identified by the World Health Organization. They have a list of priority pathogens that are underinvested targets that affect very poor countries. And we are developing rapid response platforms for pathogen X, or something like COVID that comes up unexpectedly, where everyone is naive to that pathogen and where something might have to be created from scratch. We're funded by 11 sovereign governments plus 3 philanthropic organizations, the Wellcome Trust, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the World Economic Forum. We have a 5-year budget of around $2 billion US to fund the development work. We've gotten supplemental funding for Sepi, for COVID. Our vision is a world in which epidemics are no longer a threat, and obviously we're not there yet. Our way we do that is by developing vaccines against known threats and being prepared for emerging threats. And we're doing this in a way that gives equitable access to all of these vaccines to everyone who needs them most, rather than just people's ability to pay. So we've many programs underway, but one that's most relevant for COVID is a rapid response platform request. So about a year ago, we launched this rapid platform. We're looking for technologies that can create a new vaccine that can be in the clinic within 16 weeks of identifying the viral sequence. That within 6 weeks of the first clinical dose, that person would have the clinical benefit. And from 8 weeks from an order, 100,000 doses could be prepared. And those are in general numbers that allow us to have a vaccine in testing prior to the peak of a pandemic, allowing us then to get an immediate benefit. And if it's a local outbreak, prevent the local outbreak from becoming global. Obviously with COVID, we were still in development with these platforms. We have not scaled up the manufacturing capabilities yet because we wanted the proof of concept first. But clearly this has been a great test for the speed of these platforms. So before COVID, we had launched 28 programs in less than 3 years, focused largely on MERS, Lassa, Nipah, chikungunya, and Rift Valley fever, things we don't hear about a lot in the United States, but affect a lot of poor countries. Any of those, the diseases could easily mutate and become a global spread. Most of them are very locally situated today and don't have high human-to-human transmission. They're generally some vector to human transmission. When COVID broke out, Sepi had announced already in January, those platforms that were already underway for rapid response got contracts immediately to get to phase 1 clinical studies. Our first clinical trial began in March. We now have 4 programs in phase 1 clinical testing, with the rest coming later this year. Our overall manufacturing strategy is the real focus of this presentation. Sepi we are preparing to make billions of doses available by the end of next year, with some doses delivered late this year. And I know when we talk about the end of next year, that's something no one's looking forward to. We're clearly looking to deliver as many as we can, as early as we can. We are currently supporting and financing up to 15 programs, and most of those will go into clinical development. Formulation and filling are a high potential to be a benefit. All these doses, all these vaccines eventually go into vials, and there is a limited capacity for glass as well as filling capacity around the world. So we are working to debottleneck that. Overall, the world could need between 8 and 16 billion doses if every person would need 2 doses of vaccine. And so we have a lot to do and want to maximize this number made this year. The total vaccine industry each year makes about 20 billion doses of vaccine. And so to make enough for, say, 8 billion in 1 year would be a tremendous increase over what's already a very large lift. Typically, manufacturing for vaccine development takes 4 to 7 years. So it can take significantly longer than that. And it's because all the steps are staged, such that you get a signal in preclinical studies and animal studies to know the vaccine is likely to work before you go to humans. And then you'll make small batches for those studies. If that's successful, you'll scale up and you'll go into phase 2, which gets you into knowing what's the right dose of the vaccine to get protection. And then you might scale up at risk, or you might scale up with the outcome of those trials. But you can see, because of all of the risk-based decisions, a lot of investment comes only after some data is in hand. And so this whole process generally takes many years to develop. And you only build capacity once you have a proven step ahead working. And you build stockpiles really only at the very end of this process. For COVID, and these normally require new facilities, which in themselves can take 2 or 3 years to build and validate. For COVID, everything is compressed. The clinical programs are more an adaptive design, rolling from phase 1 to phase 3 versus distinct phases. We still collect all the same safety data and know that what we're doing is we're always taking those checks before we go to the next stage. But what's really different is the manufacturing, in that everything is done at risk, at full speed, and which means that we are not waiting for results in order to get to registration, we hope, in an 18-month period from when this all started. That 18-month period would technically be the middle of next year. We're pressing to see if that can be even faster to the first half of next year or the first quarter. We are, again, funding 15 programs. We only expect 2 or 3 of these will actually reach licensure. There's no time for new facilities, so we have to find existing capacity around the world in existing facilities. And the risks we're taking are not our financial risks. We're not risking human safety by going this fast. We are risking a lot of money in that we're not waiting for success before we advance to the next stage. We're following all regulations that are typically used in human clinical studies. So the key thing here is this speed is not going to create a lot of risk for the patient. We have multiple platforms approved, and this is one way of mitigating risk, is that we have the newest, fastest programs like the RNA-based vaccines and DNA-based vaccines. We have more typical recombinant protein production and some novel adjuvants that allow us to get a higher response with a smaller dose. And then we have some live viral vector approaches, adenovirus, which was used as the second product licensed for Ebola, as well as a measles vector. And each of these are different ways of getting the RNA of the COVID virus into humans so you can make the protein and then an immune response that will protect you from natural infection. These are all just different ways of triggering that response in humans. But today, of these, what will be up to 15 programs, we don't know which will work. We don't know how much each will be able to produce. We will be looking at scale up and scale out, but we'll need to decide on what scale that is. And again, we're looking to establish a network that covers many countries in order to make sure that if borders close, we'll still be able to distribute product. In addition to making the proteins, we also need to make the adjuvants that are used to help get the molecules into the human cell, and adjuvants to increase the response. So again, to make 1 billion doses of one of these products would require 1 billion doses of adjuvant as well. So there's many manufacturing processes to improve at the same time. So our general approach is to work with our variety of partners and to start having clinical trials produced from existing facilities, to do scale up in their facilities or with contractors in order to make a larger scale for advanced clinical studies. Each of those products will be scaled out into different countries. So we're building capacity through contract in many places. And we will start to stockpile product already by the end of this month, so that when it's approved, we should have a larger amount ready to immediately deploy. Some of these vaccines will fail when they're in the clinic, and when they fail, obviously those options come off the table from a capacity perspective. Some of them may be repurposed so that we can still manufacture multiple billions. And the good news is even though if we're building capacity in more than 30 facilities, we only need 2 or 3 successful programs for us to reach that 2 to 4 billion dose range by the end of 2021. And then each successive year, we should be able to increase that capacity as well if doses are still needed. Many people believe this is a 2 or 3 year time frame before enough vaccine is out to totally stop the spread of this virus. So again, we are scaling up at risk, we are scaling out at risk and putting production in multiple places. We won't know the yield of the manufacturing processes till late this summer, and we won't know the final dose until later this year. And until we know dose, we can't start filling product. Now, because we don't know the answer to these, the yield can vary by 3-fold, the dose can vary by 5-fold. So you can see that if we go from midpoint to high or low point on any of those factors, the overall productivity can change up or down 10-fold. We're hoping to be fortunate in getting 10 times more, in which case we could produce enough product in 2 years versus 3, 4, or 5. Overall, we've done a capacity check around the global contract manufacturing space and have found enough capacity to make more than 10 billion doses of vaccine if these vaccines work. And so there is an upside potential, and we are spending about $2 billion to put that capacity in place. Again, the majority of that will be at risk because the majority of these programs will fail. For drug product, that's putting the product into a vial. We have found about 4 billion doses of capacity for filling vials around the world currently open. We have invested in 4 new glass manufacturing lines that will allow us to have enough vials for 2 billion doses. For excess over 2 billion, we're looking at novel filling approaches, blow, fill, seal, which is a nice little plastic vial that's often used for ophthalmics. Plastic vials, which are coated with silicon dioxide to make them glass-like. And we're also looking at a 200-dose bag and integrated syringe from a US company that looks very promising for mass immunization campaigns. What we're planning is unprecedented. The thought of making 2 to 4 billion doses, I would say even a couple of months ago, was laughable, and that's a quote. The word laughable has been used multiple times, but I think we've shown people enough diligence and experience and a good modeling to show that, in fact, we could exceed 4 billion doses under the right set of projects being successful. The lessons that we've learned in Ebola and other programs have been fantastic in informing us of how to prepare better here, but we're still learning a lot. And everything we do now will make us even, I would say, smarter and even be able to respond faster to the next outbreak. And outbreaks like Ebola do happen every 5 years or so. If you look back over the last 20 years, you will name 5 or 6 of those. They will continue to happen. So this is a capability that when we build, it will be used multiple times. These outcomes are only possible because of the strong science and engineering that exists in the industry today, as well as the generosity of organizations. And there is now a new financing facility that has been launched that is going to buy these vaccines, which will incent industry to continue to make vaccines and take the risk to do that development. So with that, Jennifer, I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, we've got quite a few.
I saw the light flashing.
Yes, I'm kind of skimming them through and trying to, there's a lot of the same kind of questions. A lot of questions around funding. You mentioned, you showed that slide with the flags, and the US is notably absent. And the WHO you mentioned is also, which Trump has just threatened to or is going to bow out of. So we're wondering, what is the US, you know, are we hurt by those two things, or were we going to?
No, yeah. So in many ways, CEPI so there's an organization in the US called BARDA. They've been in the news quite a bit lately as their senior leader had been reassigned. BARDA is really focused on US supply for biological threats, whether they're natural, like COVID, or intentional, some engineered threat by a foreign government, for example. And so they take care of the US population, they fund the US, and they've invested more than $4 billion already in making sure everyone in the US has has the doses they need. Sepi in many ways is BARDA for the rest of the world. And so our goal is to consolidate purchasing power and development funding from everyone else, so that and we can provide a service similar to what BARDA does in the US.
Okay,
we do work somewhat together. The CEO of Sepi is an ex-BARDA official as well. So we know each other well, and we do work together, but they are separate fundings.
Got it. A lot of the questions about the timing, the accelerated timing, you did answer. Some people are asking about vaccines for other things, like HIV. We've been studying for decades, and there's still nothing. Do you see systems changing in a positive way as a result of COVID and having things move more quickly for other vaccines, and just the type of collaborations you're doing with all these other organizations? Is this actually the lemonade of COVID, that maybe things will?
So I think COVID is bringing, so we're fortunate in that there are new technologies available today, like the RNA vaccines that were still in the infancy even 5 years ago during the Ebola outbreak. And so, these are things that, so we're always learning, and we're getting better. HIV is a really tricky virus that mutates so quickly that it's really challenging to find a vaccine. I would say the best comparator to COVID is RSV, which is also taking decades to develop a vaccine, and we're not there yet. Certain viruses, when you do create an immune response, the immune response can actually enhance the disease on the next infection. Wow. That's the issue with RSV. So after vaccination, your second infection can actually create a much more severe disease. That is a risk with COVID. They are similar in that regard, and that's one of the things that's being tracked in these early safety studies.
Right.
If that materializes, a large number of our products will likely fail, and we'll have to go to another round that are significantly more risky and longer development timing.
Yeah.
So that we could be doing this for a long time.
Yeah. There's a couple of questions on here about herd immunity. Do you think that we will be able to reach herd immunity at some point?
Yeah, so the trick here is for 65% of the population roughly to be either naturally infected or immunized in order to stop the global spread or even the local spread. And so the question is, can we vaccinate faster than everyone can be naturally infected or not? And then the thing with coronaviruses is that there are 4 naturally circulating coronaviruses. It seems like you can catch them every 3 or 4 years. And so it seems like the immunity may not be durable. And so a vaccination might protect you for a number of years, but you might need to be boosted. These are all things we'll learn over the next 5 to 10 years.
Right. Now, moving on to the question of vaccines in general, we have a question saying family members in Latin America are being bombarded with videos trying to scare them about the new technologies and vaccines. You can imagine similar things would happen around the world, given the anti-vaxxers and that. Is there a plan? Is somebody working on the communications aspect of this as well?
Absolutely. And the challenge is that it's all a matter of who you trust and where that information needs to come from. So the anti-vaccine movement is strong and it's global. And it is something that those of us who have been in the vaccine industry for most of our careers have fought for a really long time. And it's all built on misinformation, but in today's age of social media and the like, misinformation seems to carry equal weight to good solid data. And so to some extent, we will do what we can to communicate. And it's important that each region gets that information from the people they trust. And so the Western countries will need to develop their communications around this. And I think if anything, people are more interested in getting vaccines because of COVID than they might have been before.
Yeah.
And I think that the biggest challenge, and you'll probably see this even from statements from Ken Frazier, who recently made comments about not wanting to go too fast. Because when you're giving billions of doses, even if something has a 1 in a million chance of occurring, when you multiply it times a billion people, you end up with thousands of people who can be affected. So, those, and it's really challenging to design clinical studies to get to that level of adverse event.
Right. A question about if a vaccine fails, is it generally harmful or like to those who take it, or is it just fail? And
it could fail in a number of different ways. So the three main failure modes would be that there is a safety signal. And we would know that when the numbers of people who are immunized is very small. And that's why in phase 1 studies, it's generally a couple of hundred people getting a low dose and then a slightly higher dose and then a slightly higher dose until we understand what dose is protective. And then the next stage is the next place it can fail. So number one, the first thing is safety. We're generally giving vaccines to already healthy people so that we don't want to create any harm. That's always the first rule of vaccination. It's very similar to the Hippocratic Oath. The second stage is, will it be effective? And there it is to do the studies at different doses and see how much of the active ingredient is necessary to give a protective response, enough to neutralize the virus and prevent disease in the recipient. And then again, that would prevent spread. That's the next place it could fail. Either the immune response isn't strong enough, or the dose ends up being too high, or it might create a safety issue, or the dose is so high that you just can't make it. It's too expensive, too non-productive to make it. So that's another place it could fail. And there's a whole bunch of areas in the manufacturing space where, again, your inability to make it, and instability of the molecules are other places where these can fail. And that's why we think, again, 1 in 7 of our products could make it. Mm-hmm. That's about the normal rate for vaccines, about 1 in 7.
Okay. And there's questions here too about, are there different doses for different people? Like, do children and people, underweight people, do they get different dosages? Do you have to be testing on all different kinds of people?
Yeah, so for vaccines, it's a little different than small molecule drugs where you might get a dose based on your body weight. And so for the live viral vectors, the doses will be similar, because then the body continues to make vaccine because it's a virus that will spread, but it's a safe virus that gives you immunity to the other virus. So an adenovirus generally won't make humans sick. But in the meantime, it's also delivering the RNA of a COVID virus, which gives you protection against COVID without actually using the COVID virus, the full virus itself. And so in general, the dose ranges for biologics like this for immune response are very wide. And so the same dose almost works for everyone. There might be a half a dose for really small children. And the question is at what point, so you generally vaccinate the most at-risk people first. Mm-hmm. Certain groups might be excluded from the primary vaccinations until we have more data, and that would include pregnant women or women in childbearing years, and maybe the very young might be excluded from initial studies until we have a better understanding of the safety of the vaccines. So, but again, that they could potentially also be at risks, and so you don't want to wait too long for that. Many vaccines get into those populations far too late, and they end up being unprotected for a much longer time.
Right. Julian's question is about supply chain considerations for things like syringes and needles. Is that a concern?
It's a concern when we're looking at this. So again, when we're adding 50% burden to a already stressed vaccine production system. And then trying to, I think one of the issues is when we started talking about being able to make 4 billion doses of vaccine, the low and middle income countries aren't sure they can absorb more than 1 billion, because setting up those vaccine programs and getting vaccines to remote areas can be really challenging. And so there's a concern that if we overproduce, that we also might mess up the balance of trying to distribute this product 50% to the low and middle income countries and 50% to high income countries may not work if there's an abundance of vaccine. Most people don't worry about if there's an abundance. They're more worried about if there's a scarcity. And when first doses are available, there will be a scarcity. And that's where we're most concerned about things like nationalism, where the borders will close and vaccines won't leave. And so that's why we're looking at such a distributed network, because we can't afford to have our vaccines all going to one country. And especially when the funding for these vaccines come from many countries. So.
Right. Well, Lehigh has an extremely fantastic supply chain management program. So if you need people, I'm sure they could help.
This is going to be a huge supply chain. So you can imagine, again, just the sheer volume increase. And a lot of these are for new technologies where we don't have established supply chains. And so they will have to be built. We will be in full production at full scale by October across multiple platforms. And all of those things are now being ordered so that they can be in place for that time.
Nice. A little bit about Sepi. How many successful vaccines has Sepi delivered so far, and for which conditions?
So all of our so we're 3 years old, and so our vaccines are now in phase 1 clinical development. Some of those would likely get to phase 2 by now, but COVID has now stopped a lot of clinical development around the world for anything else but COVID.
Yeah.
So we have no approved vaccines today. Again, we're 3 years old, and again, that 4 to 7 year time frame applies to us as well. For vaccines going through a normal development process would be a 4 to 7 year time frame.
Right.
We believe our first phase 3 studies prior to COVID were going to be in 2022.
Yeah, that's a whole nother webinar of what's happening to everything else in the world while we're all focused on this.
That's right.
Lori's question is, will the FDA inspect the manufacturing facilities prior to launch?
Yeah, so every facility will be inspected by multiple regulators. So the country of origin where the product is manufactured inspects. The country that receives the vaccine also has the right to inspect facilities where vaccines are made. For Ebola, and I was at Merck during the Ebola outbreak and delivered the products to West Africa. That was my last job before retiring. We had 22 regulators involved to approve that product and distribute it just to West Africa, a small number of countries. And so when you think about this now for more than 200 countries, how will regulatory be done? There's a sense that there will be some agreement up front and harmonization that will rely on a group of stringent regulators like the European regulators, the FDA, and some representatives of the African regulators and Chinese regulators, et cetera, will kind of form a group. And we are set up a group under a new development facility called the ACT Accelerator, the Access to COVID Tools Accelerator. There's a team in there of regulators that are looking to harmonize the approach, how these vaccines can be licensed and distributed. So we are hoping that can be streamlined over the normal process, which is just really a torturous path.
Right. So I think what I've learned from this, it's a lot more complicated. You know, you just think about the scientific piece of it, of let's just get this, like, how can the scientists be supported to just find the cure or the vaccine? But there's so many other factors, some which sound like you're working on solving the supply chain and that, but then all of the worldwide and the ethical and all of that. Is that actually part of your job, or are you more of a scientist?
So my focus is the manufacturing strategy. I have 30 years of industry experience in manufacturing, and that's what I really bring to Sepi. I spent some time in late stage development and I engaged there. Sepi is about an 80-person organization full of all the enabling sciences that help drive vaccine development. But in fact, Sepi doesn't develop any products. We fund them, we guide them, but the work is done by independent companies, universities, et cetera, advancing those platforms. So
Right.
we are a funding mechanism. And the big challenge with the products that we focus on is that they're not great commercial products. They either, number one, are mainly focused on poor countries, and so there's no margin. And number two, they're highly unpredictable. So even at a low margin, you would do it if you knew you'd have a sale. But they're so unpredictable in incidence, and the countries are poor. We call them market failures. And it's why there needs to be another way to incent that development. And that's where Sepi was really created. The Ebola vaccine sat on the shelf for 10 years. Wow. And it still took a year to get it into West Africa because there was no way to drive it until there was a need. Our goal is to create the motivation and the incentives to make that happen before the crisis, so it's ready when the crisis does strike.
Right. Well, unfortunately, it is a little bit past 1. There's still a lot of questions here.
Sure.
A lot of people saying thank you for this talk. It's comforting to know that a Lehigh alum is managing so much of this, and we know that if you made it through Lehigh, you're a hard worker. You get it done. So we're counting on you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And there's other Lehigh grads also on the team. So.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
good.
I'm not alone there.
Excellent. Well, thank you again so much. And we will get these questions. I'm sorry to those of you whose questions did not get answered today, but we will try to get you those answers. Thank you very much, and stay safe, everybody.